This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
I'm Dan Kleffler in New York with this ABC News Digital special report on the George Zimmerman trial. A full day of testimony, adding so many details about the night Trayvon Martin was shot to death. On the stand today, a neighbor, an IT surveillance expert, and a police officer all grilled about what they remember about that night last year when Zimmerman shot Martin to death. ABC's Matt Gutman is following the trial and joins us now from Sanford, Florida, with the highlights from today's courtroom. Matt, thank you for joining us. And before we get into the few specific points that we heard from today, this week of testimony almost over. Is the prosecution being seen as having a stronger case now?
The prosecution never seemed to have that strong a case, at least for second-degree murder. Now, back in March 2012, March 13th, the homicide detective, the lead investigator on this case, recommended that George Zimmerman be brought up on manslaughter charges. Now, the state attorney at the time said, we probably don't have the evidence. Now they're going for second-degree murder. That's a tougher bar to jump over, and they put on a pretty good case, starting, of course, with the opening statement of very strong, powerful, emotional statement from the state attorney, John Guy. Really, I felt hooked the jurors. But it's been followed up by what has been a bruising cross-examination by the defense. Almost every witness that the prosecution has put up on the stand has to some extent spoken for the defense. And the defense's argument is simple. George Zimmerman may have gotten into trouble. But it was Trayvon Martin who started that fight. It was Trayvon Martin who banged Zimmerman's head against the pavement, who made him feel that he needed to fear for his life. That's why he pulled the gun out. That's why he shot Trayvon Martin. He didn't know he was 17. He did not know he was unarmed. He felt his life was threatened. And they keep hitting that point home again and again with every witness. So the prosecution is having a very hard time proving that Zimmerman went in there with evil intent, with a depraved mind. That's what the law says, that he intended somehow to get himself into trouble and to shoot Trayvon Martin. So far, analysts are telling us they don't think the prosecution has proven that.
Well, and I wanted to ask you a little more specifically on one particular piece of testimony that we heard today from the neighbor who saw the scuffle that night and made a 911 call. John Good saying he saw what appeared to be one man straddling the other during this exchange back and forth, and that it appeared to be George Zimmerman on the bottom as punches were being thrown. That testimony, did that hurt the prosecution's case?
Yes and no. It's very interesting for the prosecution to put a witness on the stand who effectively said exactly what George Zimmerman has said in his reenactment, in his first police statements, and then after. What it seemed like the prosecution may have been doing is try to diffuse some of the power of John Good's testimony. Now, he did say that it looked like Trayvon Martin was on top, pummeling Zimmerman. But what he didn't say is that he saw Trayvon Martin smashing George Zimmerman's head into the ground. The prosecution got him to admit that he never actually physically saw that. That is a key point. And as hard as the defense afterward tried to push this man, John Good, the neighbor, to say and admit that he actually saw Zimmerman's head pounded into the pavement, he did not. So that might have been something of a stalemate. Now, the 911 call that was played right after that, it was very powerful, and I think it resonated with the jurors. They were leaning forward in their seats. Maybe we can take a listen to him calling 911.
I will wait.
911 unit, please, fire medical.
Police, I just heard a shot right behind my house.
Where at?
1221 Twin Trees Lane. They're wrestling right in the back of my porch.
You just heard one shot go off?
It was either that or a rock at the window or something. I don't know. The guy's yelling help, and I'm not going outside.
1221? You said 1221?
No, 1221 Twin Trees Lane, Sanford, Florida.
Now, he also said that seconds later, he just said that he heard that Trayvon Martin was shot, and he said, oh, my God, the guy has been shot. He's been calling out for help. Police arrived a few seconds later. Now, another witness on the stand, his name is John Manolo. He also saw Zimmerman just seconds after the shooting, noticed that bloody nose, noticed the bleeding on the back of his head, and he also noticed something critical, Dan. He noticed that Zimmerman immediately said, I shot him in self-defense. I had to do it. Right off the bat, Zimmerman acted or seemed to act like he had done nothing wrong, that he had only defended himself. And that is probably going to play very strongly in court. A lot of the analysts that we're talking to are mentioning that throughout the period, from the second after the shooting, 16 months later until now, Zimmerman has maintained the same answer, the same explanation for the shooting. He had to shoot Martin because he felt his life was threatened.
Matt, I wanted to ask you about this because obviously the testimony is being looked at very closely, and it's interesting because we have somewhat of a disconnect because we're not actually in the courtroom there. And as we've been hearing, as this case first started, the 911 calls, the testimony, and some of the details that have been coming out, it's been difficult to kind of put a face to the timeline of events. And as you're hearing the testimony being played out in front of family members, in front of witnesses, in front of friends, what has been the reaction as we've been hearing the 911 calls and these details?
The reaction has been varied and powerful, and it's been multifaceted. There's been a reaction in the courtroom. There's been the reaction that you don't see of the jurors, the way they're leaning forward, how eager they are, how hard they're listening, how furiously they're scribbling notes. Many times during the trial, we've also noticed, especially when you hear those 911 calls played like the one we just heard, in which you hear calls for help, in which you hear that gunshot. Trayvon Martin's mother, his father, marching out of the court, unable to take the pain of hearing their son die again and again. No matter what the causes were for his death, it is a very painful moment. So the intensity of emotion in the courtroom is palpable. Also out of it, in social media, this thing has been huge. There were more tweets about the Zimmerman trial yesterday than there were anything having to do with SCOTUS, about the Supreme Court. People are eagerly watching this. It's been streaming on multiple channels. All of the local channels here have broken from their regularly scheduled programs every single day to stream this live all day, gavel to gavel. It is incredible the extent to which this is getting massive coverage, especially here, Dan.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's a case certainly that's grabbed the entire country's attention and really worldwide attention as well. Matt, going forward then, what witnesses do we expect next week?
Well, today we just heard a lot of, we heard the last few neighbors, we heard about the police officers who tended to Trayvon Martin and who detained Zimmerman the moments after the shooting. Next week, probably on Monday, we're going to hear from that homicide detective, the lead investigator in this case. That is the guy who recommended that Zimmerman be brought up on manslaughter charges. He said that all of this, the shooting, the altercation, could all have been avoided had only Zimmerman not left his vehicle that night. That is why he recommended manslaughter charges. He is very likely going to take the stand, going to be a strong witness for the prosecution. The big question, Dan, how is the prosecution going to get this guy to admit that he should have charged Zimmerman with second-degree murder when he only charged him with manslaughter? That is going to be a bridge that is going to be difficult for them to cross.
More details as the case will continue on next week. ABC's Matt Gutman in Sanford, Florida. Matt, thank you for your time and your insight. We appreciate that. And, of course, we do have a complete recap on abcnews.com as this first full week of the trial gets underway, and next week will begin in just a few days. For now, I'm Dan Kleffler in New York with this ABC News Digital Special Report.
This has been a special report from ABC News Digital.